There's a reason you flinch at silence, a reason your chest tightens, your skin crawls, your thoughts start racing the moment the noise dies down. And it's not because silence is dangerous, it's because you were conditioned to feel that it was. You weren't born afraid of quiet. You were born in it. You came from it. Silence was your first environment. Before the words, before the labels, before the noise of the world wrapped itself around you like a script. And somewhere along the way, they began to train you, to program you away from that stillness. They taught you to associate silence with emptiness, with loneliness, with threat. Why? Because in silence, something ancient stirs, something beyond language, a knowing that cannot be marketed, controlled, or broken. And if you ever touched it, truly touched it, you would start to remember, not with your mind, but with your essence, a memory deeper than experience, older than trauma, purer than identity. And that remembering would threaten everything they built around you, because the system only works if you forget who you are. So they made sure the forgetting was constant, subtle, systematic. They filled your days with noise, bells, buzzes, notifications, entertainment, arguments, advertisements, headlines, deadlines, endless commentary. They created a world where silence feels like failure, where doing nothing is seen as weakness, where stillness is a sin. But the truth is this: silence is not the absence of life. It is the presence of what lives beneath it. It's the ocean under the waves, the sky behind the storm, the self behind the noise. And if you sat long enough, if you stopped playing the character, you'd feel it. A vibration, a hum, not a thought, not a belief, something older, something whole. That is the real you, the part they couldn't reach, the part they had to distract you from at all costs, because silence reveals it. Silence dissolves the mask. Silence is the sound of the program unraveling. That's why they taught you to fear it. They didn't want you to meet the parts of yourself that don't need validation, the parts that don't perform, the parts that know. Because when you stop responding to the noise, when you stop reacting like they trained you to, you become ungovernable. You become sovereign, you return. And the world has no script for that. So it panics, it punishes, it labels you antisocial, lazy, depressed, disconnected. But maybe you're not disconnected. Maybe you're tuning in, tuning out the chaos to hear something that never left you, just waited beneath the static. The more you listen, the louder it becomes, even in silence, especially in silence, because silence isn't quiet, it's full, it's overflowing. It contains everything the world convinced you were missing. Love, peace, truth. Not as concepts, but as direct experiences, as realities that were always there, hidden behind the noise of who you were taught to be. And yet, every time you try to go there, to meditate, to pause, to breathe, your nervous system resists. You feel the tremble, the discomfort. That's not a sign that something's wrong. That's the residue of the programming. That's the system panicking as its grip loosens. You were trained to panic in stillness, because stillness is where the veil falls, where the act dissolves, where the truth waits. And that truth is not loud. It doesn't need to be. It doesn't shout. It just is. But when you touch it, it rewrites everything. Suddenly, you see that so much of what you called normal was just noise, just distraction, just armor. And the silence? It was never your enemy. It was your invitation, your return, your origin. So ask yourself this: what are you really afraid of when everything goes quiet? Is it the emptiness? Or is it the truth that finally has space to speak? Because maybe you're not afraid of silence at all. Maybe you're afraid of remembering what lives inside it. Before we continue, comment where you're watching this from, and make sure to like and subscribe if this already speaks to something inside you. You were trained to be an echo, not a voice, to reflect noise, not truth, to respond, not remember. And it began so early, didn't it? Before you even had language, you were absorbing frequencies, the tone of voices around you, the urgency in the room, the hunger in your caretaker's eyes for you to become something specific, something acceptable, something that made them feel safe. You learned, without words, that your silence made others uncomfortable, that your stillness was threatening to those who had long abandoned their own. So you performed, smiled on command, cried on schedule, adapted, folded your essence into socially approved shapes. And each time you did, the silence inside you dimmed a little more. Because silence is not just the absence of noise, it's the presence of self, and they couldn't allow that self to fully exist. It was too wild, too sensitive, too radiant, too ungoverned. So they built a world where constant reaction is seen as intelligence, where anxiety is disguised as productivity, and where overstimulation is mistaken for connection. And in that world, you forgot the taste of your own being. They gave you a role instead, a script, one with lines like, "I'm fine, and I just need to push through," and "success means I'm okay." You repeated them until you believed them, until the silence within became unbearable, because it started whispering inconvenient truths. It reminded you of the parts you had exiled, the emotions you swallowed, the dreams you dismissed, the child who knew how to be without proving anything. That child still lives in the silence, waiting. But to meet them, you'd have to stop performing. You'd have to pause long enough to feel the grief of what you gave up to be acceptable. And grief is something the system never taught you to handle. It taught you to replace it with goals, with entertainment, with substances, with the illusion of progress. But you can't outrun the silence forever. It follows you, like a shadow that isn't your enemy, but your echo, trying to return you to what you lost. And so the pattern continues. You scroll, you binge, you grind, you strive. Not because you're shallow, but because you're terrified. Terrified of what you might hear if you stopped, if you sat alone, with no screen, no noise, no performance. Just breath, just stillness, just that deep hum of the real you. And that fear, it's not yours, it was implanted, conditioned into you by generations of others who also feared silence, because their truth was never welcomed there. They passed down a legacy of noise, of distraction, of disembodiment. But your body remembers. It remembers the rhythm of nature, the pulse of presence, the sacredness of simply being. And every time you feel overwhelmed by the silence, that's not evidence that you're broken. It's proof that something deeper is trying to surface, something original, something holy. You see, the system isn't just external, it's internal. It lives in your nervous system, in your reactions, in the way your thoughts hijack your peace. You were programmed not just through media or schooling, but through moments of pain that went unprocessed, through beliefs you adopted to stay loved, through fears you inherited without knowing their origin. And that programming thrives on noise, because noise keeps you in reaction. But silence? Silence brings awareness. And awareness dissolves control. That's why they fear it. Not because it's empty, but because it's full of truths too inconvenient for the machine to allow. Truths like, you were never meant to earn rest. You were never meant to compete for love. You were never meant to live from the outside in. But when those truths rise in the silence, so does grief, so does rage, so does tenderness. And that's where your real healing begins. Not with more doing, but with finally undoing. Undoing the lie. That you must always be useful. That your worth depends on your noise. But there's something beautiful in this reckoning, something sacred in the moment you stop running from silence and start sitting with it. When you stop asking it for answers and just let it speak, not in language but in sensation, in presence, in remembering. Because silence will never force you. It's patient. It waits. And the moment you lean in, even a little, it starts revealing. A layer at a time, a memory at a time, a fragment of your original self at a time, until one day you don't just hear the silence, you become it, you carry it, you speak from it, and when you do, others feel it, because they've forgotten too, and your presence becomes a mirror, a frequency, a reminder that the noise was never them, it was their armor, and the silence, that was home all along. There's a strange kind of ache that comes when you start to remember yourself, not as a story, but as a presence, not as the version you perfected for approval, but as the quiet force that existed before anyone told you who to be. And this ache, it doesn't announce itself like pain. It moves like a ghost through your chest. You feel it when you're alone and nothing is wrong, but something still isn't right. You feel it when the room is silent and suddenly you hear your own heartbeat, like it's trying to speak. You feel it when you wake up in the morning and, for a brief second, forget who you are supposed to be. And in that flicker, there's peace. That flicker is the truth they tried to erase. That before the striving, before the shame, before the personality they applauded, you were already whole, already enough, already light. But they couldn't let you know that. Because a person who knows their worth without performance cannot be controlled, cannot be sold an identity, cannot be manipulated by fear. So they buried that version of you beneath layers of noise, expectations, comparison, trauma, and most effectively, distraction. Because the more distracted you are, the more disconnected you stay, and the more disconnected you stay, the easier it is to confuse survival with purpose. They taught you to chase purpose like a prize, as if it lives outside you, as if it's something to achieve, not something to uncover. But purpose is not a goal. It's a frequency, a remembering, and you only find it when you stop running, when you get still enough to feel what's always been underneath the noise. That's why so many people live their whole lives feeling like something is missing, even when they have everything they were told to want. Because what's missing isn't a thing, it's themselves, the real self, the one that only speaks in silence, the one that doesn't need a title or applause or proof, the one that remembers what it's like to simply be. But that self, your original self, can't compete with the volume of your conditioning. It whispers, it waits, and unless you make space, deliberate space, it won't come forward. Not because it's weak, but because it's sacred. It will not scream over the lies you still believe. And so you go years, decades even, feeling a low hum of discontent, trying to fix it with more doing, more goals, more healing even. But healing done from the same noise that created the wound is just another form of avoidance. What if the healing you need isn't another strategy, but a surrender to silence, to stillness, to the ache you've been trying to outrun? Because inside that ache is the doorway, and the key has always been stillness. But it takes courage to be still in a world that worships motion. It takes rebellion to stop performing in a system that rewards the mask. But every time you return to silence, every time you put down the performance, you reclaim a piece of yourself, a piece the world had no place for, a piece that knows how to love without attachment, how to feel without fear, how to exist without apology. You begin to realize silence was never empty. It was always full, full of your ancestors' wisdom, full of your body's memory, full of every version of you that survived by going quiet so you could keep going. But now silence is no longer survival, it's revival. And when you sit in it long enough, you begin to hear things, not voices but knowings, a deep sense of yes or no that doesn't need to be justified, a clarity that cuts through the noise like a blade through fog. And that clarity, it's not learned, it's remembered. It's the part of you that was never confused, never lost, never unsure. The part they tried to erase through programming, through fear, through convincing you that your truth needed to be proven. It doesn't. It just needs space. And silence is that space. But to reclaim that silence, you must pass through everything that's been avoiding it. The boredom, the restlessness, the grief, the guilt of doing nothing, the fear of wasting time. These are not obstacles, they're initiations. They are the thresholds of your return. And every time you sit through them, every time you breathe through the discomfort instead of escaping it, you dissolve another layer of the false self. The self that was built to survive in a world that feared your depth. And as that false self fades, what's left is not a blank slate. It's your essence, the part of you that knows how to live without noise, how to walk through the world in alignment, how to listen not to the chaos, but to the calm, not to the programming, but to the pulse beneath it. Because when you're truly in silence, you don't feel empty. You feel connected, not to thoughts or roles, but to life itself. You feel the pulse of the earth, the breath of existence, the frequency that everything moves to, even when no one is speaking. And that frequency is where your truth lives. Not in the mind, but in the space between thoughts. Not in the performance, but in the pause. And once you've touched it, truly touched it, the noise can never control you in the same way again. You may still hear it, but you won't obey it. Because something deeper is guiding you now, something ancient, something unshakable, something silent. They never needed to imprison your body. Just your attention, that was the real design, the real trick. Not chains or cages, but loops, mental loops, emotional loops. invisible frequencies pulsing through every part of your day, training you to respond, to react, to repeat. That's what programming is. Not some obvious control, it's subtle. It feels like choice, it feels like ambition, it feels like personality. But it's not. It's a script written by systems that needed you predictable, manageable, disconnected from your essence. And it worked so well because they didn't just give you noise, they gave you meaning in that noise. Metrics, achievements, likes, roles, labels. They conditioned you to believe your value lives in motion, in validation, in visibility, and silence threatens all of that, because in silence the spell breaks. In silence you realize that your personality was often just a defense mechanism, a mask molded by fear, a performance born of necessity. And as that realization dawns, it hurts. It stings, because you start to see just how much of your life was lived as someone else, someone smaller, someone safer, someone programmed. But you were never meant to stay that way. The soul cannot be permanently buried. It leaks through the cracks, through your anxiety, through your burnout, through your inexplicable sadness in the middle of successful days. That sadness is not dysfunction. It's a signal, a soul-level alarm clock saying, this isn't who you are. But most people silence that alarm with more doing, more noise, more denial. Because the truth, real truth, is disruptive. It doesn't flatter your ego. It dismantles it. It doesn't reinforce the mask. It tears it apart. And when you begin to hear that truth again, when silence opens, that doorway, everything you thought you were begins to shake. You may cry for no reason. You may feel rage without a target. You may grieve a life you haven't even lived yet. That's part of the return, part of the remembering. You're not going crazy. You're waking up. And waking up is messy. It's not poetic at first, it's disorienting. Because the system didn't just give you distractions, it made them feel like home. So when you start pulling away from them, you feel lost. That's normal. You feel bored. You feel anxious. You feel like you're wasting time. But that's the conditioning speaking. That's the loop trying to keep you in orbit. Let it scream. Let it squirm. Just don't obey it. Because behind that noise, behind the mental panic, is a deeper calm trying to emerge. A calm that doesn't need evidence or justification. A calm that just is. And the more you choose it, the stronger it gets. Not instantly. Not in a rush. But like muscle. Like memory. You learn to sit in the silence and let the false self unravel. Layer by layer, loop by loop, until you begin to remember what it feels like to be undistracted. To be empty in the best way. Not hollow but open. Not lost, but spacious. And in that space, the real voice begins to rise. And here's the sacred paradox. They made you fear silence because silence is where your power lives. The power not to dominate, but to discern. Not to react, but to respond. Not to conform, but to align. And that kind of power cannot be handed to you. It must be remembered, reclaimed. And silence is the womb of that reclamation. It's where you stop being what the world expects and start becoming what your soul remembers. It's where you stop reaching and start receiving. Stop performing and start aligning. And alignment, it doesn't scream. It hums. It moves with precision, with grace, with clarity. And clarity is a threat to the system, because a clear soul cannot be manipulated. It cannot be sold a false dream. It cannot be baited into fear. That's why silence is painted as dangerous, because clarity threatens control. But clarity doesn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It unfolds, slowly, in layers, and each layer comes with grief. The grief of seeing how long you've lived someone else's script, the grief of noticing how deeply you believed the lie, the grief of realizing how many of your dreams weren't yours, they were adaptations, and this grief is holy. It is not weakness. It is a cleansing, a purging, a sacred burning of the false. Let it burn. Let it wash through you. Because what remains after the fire is truth, and truth is quiet, not passive, not weak, just quiet. It doesn't need to argue. It doesn't need applause. It just is, and you were made of it, long before they taught you to forget. So now the invitation isn't to find something new, but to return to the part of you that was never broken, never programmed, never lost, to return to the breath before the thought, to the presence before the persona, to the silence that sings the truth. You may not be able to live there all the time, but you can visit. You can return again and again until the visit becomes residence, until the silence feels more like home than the noise ever did. That's how remembering works. Not as a one-time event, but as a spiral. You return to the same truths, but each time deeper, each time truer, each time closer to the frequency of who you were before the world told you who to be. There's something terrifying about realizing that most of what you called you was a survival response. Not a conscious choice, not a free expression, but a shape you learned to take to be loved, to be safe, to be acceptable in a world that feared your silence and rejected your fullness. And the deeper you go into stillness, the more clearly you begin to see it. Not all at once, but in slow, painful waves. You notice how your personality formed around what was missing, how your confidence was stitched from fear, how your independence grew from abandonment, how your kindness often came from a terror of being disliked. You begin to notice how you've been rehearsing your existence, smiling when sad, laughing when numb, nodding when something inside you screamed no. And all of it seemed normal, even mature, because everyone around you was doing the same thing, echoing each other's conditioning, rewarding each other for staying asleep. But silence doesn't care about appearances. It isn't impressed by performance. It pulls everything false into the light. And when that happens, when the masks start to slide off, there is no going back. You can pretend for a while, but the pretending hurts more each time, because now you've tasted something real, something unprogrammed, something that can't be undone. This is where many people turn back. This is where the path narrows, because it's one thing to glimpse the truth. It's another to live from it. It costs everything that isn't real, and you will be tempted to retreat, to go back into the noise, into the distractions, into the false certainty of roles. But those comforts no longer comfort you. They irritate. They itch. They no longer fit because they were never meant to. You've outgrown the cage, and the silence, though terrifying, is starting to feel more honest, more stable, more trustworthy than the noise ever was. It doesn't lie to you. It doesn't flatter you. It doesn't gaslight you. It just reflects. And sometimes that reflection is brutal. You see the things you avoided, the words you swallowed, the dreams you abandoned, the betrayals you justified, but you also begin to see the strength it took to survive, the brilliance it took to adapt, the depth that was always there, even when you couldn't feel it. Because underneath all the conditioning, all the programming, all the noise, you are not broken. You are buried, covered in layers of shoulds and scripts and systems that taught you how to function, but never how to feel. That taught you how to perform, but never how to be. And now the silence is undoing all of that, not by force, but by presence, not by violence, but by stillness. And that stillness is a teacher, a guide, a mirror. It shows you not just where you lost yourself, but how to come home. It shows you that healing isn't becoming something new. It's remembering what was true before the world told you otherwise. It's unlearning the noise and relearning the signal. And the signal is always there, always has been. It hums beneath the chaos, beneath the fear, beneath the thoughts that scream you're not enough. Because enoughness isn't earned, it's remembered. And you don't remember it by reading more books, doing more courses, chasing more healing. You remember it by getting quiet. So quiet that the old thoughts don't know what to do. So quiet that the old identities panic. So quiet that the old pain starts to rise. Not to torture you, but to be released. That's what silence does. It brings it all up. Not to drown you, but to cleanse you. To detox the soul. To empty out what was never truly yours. The beliefs, the fears, the roles, the inherited stories. All of it surfaces in silence. That's why it feels so overwhelming at first. Not because you're weak, but because you're finally strong enough to face it. Strong enough to feel without fleeing, to grieve without guilt, to sit without solving. And in that sitting, something shifts. Slowly, gently, authentically. You stop trying to fix yourself and you start listening to yourself. And what you hear is not broken. What you hear is sacred. Sacred not in some grand, untouchable way, but in an earthy, raw, breath-on-glass kind of way. You remember that divinity doesn't live in temples made by hands. It lives in the silence between your heartbeats, in the pause between your inhale and exhale, in the moments when you are fully here, with nothing to prove, nothing to hide, nothing to control. That is where real power lives, and that power has no interest in performance. It doesn't need a stage, it doesn't crave approval, it simply is, rooted, quiet, clear. And when you live from that place, everything changes. Not always in external ways. Sometimes your life looks the same, but the way you inhabit it becomes different. You move with intention. You speak with truth. You choose with alignment. And that, more than anything, is what the system fears. A person who is not reacting but responding. A person who doesn't need noise to know who they are. Because now you've remembered something the noise tried to erase, that your worth was never in the doing, it was always in the being, and being begins in silence. You were never just silenced. You were separated from the sound of your ancestors, from the knowing in your bones, from the pulse that once connected your breath to the breath of the world. It wasn't accidental, it was designed. They didn't just strip away your rituals, your language, your story, they stripped away your stillness. Because within that stillness lived a lineage of truth too dangerous to let live. Truths that don't require books or teachers or gurus. Truths that rise when everything else is quiet. You can feel it, can't you? When the world stops spinning for just a moment, and you can hear something ancient humming beneath the surface. That hum is older than any empire. It carries songs you've never heard but somehow remember. Visions you never saw but somehow recognize. That is ancestral memory. It's not mystical. It's real. It lives in your body, in the blood that has crossed continents, in the heartbeats that survived famine, exile, and fire. But the system made that memory feel unreachable by burying it under noise, by replacing sacred pauses with productivity, by making you feel shame when you stop, shame when you rest, shame when you listen inward. And so the silence became foreign, unfamiliar, even threatening. But it's not the silence that threatens you, it's what it reveals. And what it reveals is this: you are not disconnected. You were disconnected. That's a painful distinction, because it forces you to face the fact that your suffering wasn't your fault, but your healing is still your responsibility. No one's coming to lift the veil for you. The system isn't going to apologize. The noise won't stop screaming. But you can choose to pause. You can choose to listen. You can choose to remember. And in that choice, you begin to reclaim your inheritance. Not money, not land, but frequency. Frequency that was carried in ceremony, in dreamtime, in lullabies sung by people who never got to finish their stories. Their silence is in you now, not as absence, but as invitation, to pick up what they were forced to drop, to continue a truth that couldn't be killed, only buried. And every time you sit in silence, every time you let the discomfort pass through you, you dig a little deeper into that sacred ground. You become an archaeologist of your own soul. You begin to uncover the ruins of the self they told you didn't exist. And in those ruins, you find something astonishing, your own voice. Not the one trained to say the right things, but the one that trembles with truth, even when it risks rejection. And that voice doesn't speak in complete sentences. It speaks in sensations, in instincts, in chills down your spine when something resonates, in tears that fall without warning, in laughter that rises from nowhere. That's your signal system. That's your original language, and it only comes alive in silence, not because silence creates it, but because silence removes what blocks it. You were never meant to live disconnected from that signal. That was the real theft. They made you believe you needed authority to know what's real, that you needed permission to trust your own knowing. But truth isn't given. It's remembered, and it doesn't arrive through debate. It arrives through surrender, through stillness, through the courage to sit with the not knowing until the knowing returns on its own. And it will. It always does. Because truth is magnetic. It pulls you back when you stop running. It wraps around you when you stop resisting. And that's when you start to see the world not as they told you it was, but as it actually is. And what you'll see may shock you, because you'll realize that the system wasn't built to support your soul, it was built to suppress it. That the society you've tried so hard to fit into was never designed for you to feel whole, just to feel busy. And you'll see that so many of your struggles were not personal failures, but logical reactions to a culture that rewards numbness and punishes presence. Silence shows you this. Not with anger, but with clarity. Not with drama, but with depth. And in that clarity, your pain transforms. It stops being a burden and starts being a compass. It stops being shameful and starts being sacred. Because it was never about fixing yourself. It was about finding yourself underneath everything that made you feel broken. And that self, the one buried in noise, is more alive than you imagined. It's fierce. It's soft. It's vast. It's not trying to be spiritual. It is spirit, embodied. And that embodiment terrifies the machine. Because an embodied soul doesn't buy lies. It doesn't chase false goals. It doesn't need to be convinced of its worth. It walks differently, speaks differently, listens differently, and above all, it creates silence around it. The kind of silence that heals just by existing. You've met people like this. Maybe you've been that person, even if just for a moment. Someone walks into a room and without saying a word, they shift the energy. Not because of what they do, but because of what they carry. Presence, alignment, truth. That is the fruit of silence. Not just internal peace, but external resonance. A field that others feel even if they don't understand it. That's why your silence matters. Not just for you, but for everyone you meet. Every space you enter, every generation that comes after you. You're not just healing for yourself, you're healing a fracture that's been echoing for centuries. A disconnection that's been normalized for so long, it became culture. But now, in your silence, you're remembering. And every time you remember, you undo the forgetting. Not just in you, but in the field around you. You become the signal again. And that signal is stronger than noise, always. You begin to realize something strange. The more silence you allow into your life, the louder the world becomes, not with truth, but with resistance. People start pulling away or clinging tighter. Your relationships shift, your routines crack. The places that once felt comforting begin to feel hollow. It's not because anything's wrong, it's because you're vibrating differently now. You're no longer matching the frequency of performance. You're no longer speaking the language of urgency. And that shift disrupts the field. It confuses people. Because without noise, without hustle, without the predictable rhythm of distraction, they don't know how to place you. They can't control you. You become unreadable to the system. That's what silence does. It removes you from the script, and when you're no longer playing your part, the entire play feels off to those still acting. But this isn't a mistake. It's a sign of alignment, because silence is not passive. It's provocative. It forces recalibration. It demands truth, and that demand unsettles what was built on avoidance. Suddenly you notice things you never saw before. How conversations are filled with empty words. How so much activity is just noise disguised as purpose. How people laugh without joy, speak without connection, touch without presence. It's heartbreaking. Not because you're judging, but because you remember what it feels like to live from somewhere deeper. And it hurts to see people you love still trapped in the script, still mistaking their programming for their personality. But you can't pull them out with words. You can't awaken someone with information. You can only embody the signal. And that embodiment starts with silence, with stillness, with becoming the space that others forgot existed. That's how you change the world, not by fighting noise with more noise, but by creating a frequency so clear that it makes distortion obvious. Not with confrontation, but with presence. The system doesn't know how to defend against that. It knows how to fight rebellion. It knows how to suppress anger, but it doesn't know what to do with someone who is simply aligned. And being aligned doesn't mean being perfect. It means being present, real, clear. It means your insides match your outsides. Your no means no. Your yes means yes. Your rest is no longer shameful. Your stillness is no longer something to apologize for. That clarity becomes a kind of mirror, and mirrors make people uncomfortable, especially when they've spent their lives avoiding their reflection. But your job is not to shrink so others feel comfortable in their distortion. Your job is to hold the frequency, to become the silence that reminds others of what they've buried. And sometimes that means standing alone, not forever, but long enough to remember that your worth isn't in being chosen. It's in being true. And truth often walks ahead, clearing the path for those still finding their feet. It walks in silence. It walks with grace. And it leaves footprints of liberation behind it. You'll begin to notice something else too. You're more sensitive now, not in the fragile sense, but in the accurate sense. Your body becomes an instrument again. You feel when something is off, even if no one says it. You sense when someone's words don't match their energy. You notice the shift in a room when a lie is spoken. That sensitivity isn't a curse, it's a return. It's how your ancestors lived. It's how children are born, fully tuned. But in a world addicted to numbness, sensitivity feels like weakness. That's part of the programming, because a sensitive soul is a powerful soul, one that can't be manipulated, one that feels the harm before it's normalized, one that knows when something sacred is being violated. So they had to teach you to doubt it, to dull it, to shame it. But silence brings it back. It reawakens your signal, and once it's back online, you begin to trust it more than anything else, more than logic, more than tradition, more than what others say is right, because your body never forgot. It was just waiting for you to listen again, and this listening becomes your compass. You stop needing external validation to make decisions. You stop asking for permission to feel what you feel. You start living from alignment, not because it's trendy, but because it's the only thing that feels like home. And alignment doesn't mean ease. It often means discomfort. It means facing the places where you've been out of tune for years. It means grieving who you had to be to survive. It means shedding identities that once protected you. But the cost of staying misaligned is too high now. The noise is too loud, the dissonance too painful. So you keep returning to silence, not as an escape, but as a sanctuary, as the only space where your soul can breathe. And in that breath you remember again. This is what it feels like to be whole. And that wholeness changes everything, not in grand, explosive ways, but in steady, grounded ways. You sleep deeper. You speak less but mean more. You stop trying to prove your worth and start expressing your truth. Your relationships shift, not because you push people away, but because you stop pretending. And those who are ready, those who are also waking up, will find you. Not because you're loud, but because your frequency calls to them. That's the quiet revolution. That's the power of silence. It doesn't demand. It doesn't convince. It simply exists. And in its existence, it creates space for others to remember themselves. The most dangerous thing you can do in a system built on performance is nothing. To stop, to sit, to listen, not to the world, but to the absence of it. Because the moment you stop participating in the noise, you break the cycle. You interrupt the spell. You stop feeding the machine. And the machine doesn't like that. Not because it cares about you, but because it needs your attention to survive. Attention is the currency of programming. Your focus, your clicks, your reactions, your fear, that's the fuel. And silence cuts the cord. Silence is not passive, it's refusal. A sacred kind of rebellion that doesn't shout, doesn't protest, doesn't rage. It just stops, withdraws energy, reclaims the gaze. And that is the one thing the system cannot program. A soul that has remembered how to be still. That's why silence is so aggressively filled, not by accident, but by design. They make you feel like rest is laziness, like boredom is failure, like stillness is stagnation. But these are lies spoken in loud colors, because the truth is stillness is the source, rest is the reset, and boredom is the doorway back to presence. But they needed you too stimulated to remember that, too restless to sit through the detox, too addicted to motion to realize most of your movement wasn't growth, it was escape. And it's not just your personal escape, it's generational. Entire bloodlines running from grief. Families built on silence, but not the sacred kind. The kind that hides truth, the kind that buries pain, the kind that smiles through the fracture because the mask has become more familiar than the face. And when you begin to heal, when you choose silence, you don't just meet your own pain, you meet theirs. The grief your mother never named, the rage your father never expressed, the confusion your grandparents swallowed to survive. It all lives in you, not to punish, but to be seen, to be held, to be released. And silence is the only space wide enough to contain it. Because silence doesn't judge, it doesn't analyze, it just holds, it allows. And in that allowance, healing begins. Not through fixing, not through logic, through being, through breath, through presence. And this is why your healing matters, because it doesn't stop with you. It ripples backward through your lineage and forward through your future. You become the one who listened, the one who sat, the one who said, "It ends with me." But endings are never clean. They are not poetic or Instagram-worthy. They are messy, mournful, holy, and silence holds space for all of it, for the collapse, for the confusion, for the sacred unbecoming, because that's what awakening really is, not becoming more, but becoming less. Less programmed, less performative, less divided, and in that less you begin to feel more truth, more tenderness, more clarity, and yes, more pain. But it's a different kind of pain, not the pain of distortion, the pain of detox, the pain of release. It's sharp, but it's pure, and it moves. It doesn't get stuck like the pain you've been carrying for years. It flows, because silence opens the channel. It unblocks the dam. It lets what needs to leave. And in its place, something softer arrives, not instantly, not dramatically, but gently, like a breeze through a window you forgot was open. And the breeze speaks, not in words, but in knowing. It tells you things you've always felt, but never believed, that you are enough, that you are not too much, that your sensitivity is a gift, that your pace is perfect, that your body is wise, that your boundaries are sacred, that you don't need to be more to be loved. You need to be honest, to be free, and that kind of honesty can't be performed. It can't be taught. It must be remembered. And remembering happens in silence, in the moments between moments, in the breath between thoughts, in the gaze that doesn't need explanation. And this remembering, it rewires everything, not all at once, but in layers. You begin to choose differently, speak differently, feel differently, not because you're trying, but because you're aligned. And alignment doesn't force, it flows. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't demand attention, it creates resonance. You begin to feel the difference between noise and truth, not intellectually but viscerally. You walk into a room and feel the static. You open your phone and feel the pull. But now you know what it is. You can name it, not from judgment, but from clarity. And that clarity gives you power, not over others, but over your own energy. You learn to say no without guilt, to unplug without apology, to rest without shame, not because you've escaped the world, but because you've remembered how to exist inside it without losing yourself. That's the miracle of silence. It doesn't take you away. It brings you back, back to the body, back to the moment, back to the hum of your own heartbeat, which was always trying to guide you home. And now you no longer need to explain yourself. You no longer seek validation for your stillness. You understand that your presence is medicine, your calm is contagious, your rest is resistance, and every time you choose silence, you plant a seed in the soil of the collective, a seed that says, there is another way, a seed that may sprout in someone else's life without you even knowing it. That is the quiet revolution. That is the transmission of truth, not through volume, but through vibration. And your vibration, once aligned, becomes unstoppable, because it carries the authority of authenticity. And that is the one thing the noise cannot mimic. It can imitate, but not duplicate, because truth, real truth, can only be felt, and you've felt it now. And once you feel it, you can never unfeel it. That is the beginning of freedom. There comes a moment, quiet, unceremonious, when you realize you no longer identify with the version of yourself that used to carry the noise. You see that version clearly now. Anxious, overextended, constantly performing, constantly reaching, saying yes when every fiber screamed no. That version wasn't bad. It was brilliant. It adapted to survive. It learned the script so well it convinced even you. But it was a mask. A beautiful, clever, exhausted mask. And now it's falling off. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped feeding it. Silence has a way of starving illusions. When the applause fades, when the feedback stops, when the world is no longer reflected through the eyes of others, you meet yourself. And for many, that meeting is terrifying, because the roles were comforting, even when they hurt. The routine was familiar, even when it numbed. But now you've outgrown it, not by effort, but by frequency. Your vibration has changed. Your body knows. Your soul knows, and even if your mind tries to drag you back, it can't quite hold on the way it used to, because you've seen what's real. You've felt the hum of truth underneath the chaos. you've remembered. That you are not a brand, not a role, not a function. You are a being, alive, awake, whole. And wholeness doesn't need to be proven. It doesn't need to be broadcasted. It doesn't need to explain itself to those still trapped in performance. That's the grace silence gives you. It removes the compulsion to explain. You no longer need to translate your truth into a language others approve of. You can simply live it, quietly, fully, unapologetically, and people will notice. Some will be drawn to you, not because you're loud, but because your calm calls something forward in them. Others will reject you, not because you've wronged them, but because your presence exposes what they've spent years avoiding. Let both happen. Let them come. Let them go. Because you are no longer performing for approval. You are anchored in truth. And truth doesn't chase. It doesn't plead. It simply stands, breath by breath, step by step, unshaken. Not because it's invincible, but because it's real. And real doesn't need protection. It just needs presence. You begin to see how much of your energy used to go into maintaining false connection, into performing intimacy instead of embodying it, into playing roles that made others feel comfortable, even when it cost you your aliveness. But now silence has revealed the price, and you're no longer willing to pay it. You'd rather sit in solitude than be surrounded by noise disguised as affection. You'd rather speak less and mean it than fill the air with words that betray your truth. You'd rather disappoint others than abandon yourself again. This isn't selfishness, it's remembrance. It's the restoration of your inner authority, the voice that doesn't need a committee, the compass that doesn't need a map, the knowing that rises not from logic but from alignment. And once you begin living from that place, you can never go back. You can visit old patterns, but they feel foreign now, like clothes that no longer fit, like songs you once loved, but now sound hollow. Because you've changed, not superficially, but fundamentally. And this change, it's not dramatic, it's not always visible, but it's undeniable. You speak slower, you move with intention, you listen with your whole body, you rest without guilt. You no longer reach for distraction at every pause. You let the pause be the point. You welcome the in-between. You find sacredness in the spaces that used to terrify you. And in those spaces, life begins to speak, not in commands, but in invitations, not in threats, but in whispers. Go here, breathe now, let go, turn inward. Trust this. That trust, once foreign, becomes your foundation. Not blind faith, but embodied certainty. A knowing you don't need to defend. A silence you don't need to explain. That's when you realize you don't need to seek truth, you are truth. When you stop trying to be anything else, and others will feel it, not through your words, but through your frequency. Your presence will become a tuning fork. Those who are ready will find their own silence reflected in yours, and those who are not will push back, sometimes violently, because silence threatens everything built on noise. It strips away the armor. It reveals the raw, and the raw is terrifying to the unready. But your job is not to be palatable. Your job is to be real, to be whole, to be present. You don't need to convince anyone of your path. You just need to walk it. And as you do, you'll begin to see others waking up, not because you preached, but because you modeled something they had forgotten was possible. A way of being that doesn't rely on performance, a life that doesn't collapse when the noise fades, a self that doesn't disappear when no one is watching. This is the quiet revolution. Not loud, not flashy, but unstoppable, because it's built on what cannot be faked. Truth, presence, silence. And you are becoming the embodiment of it. It's strange, isn't it? How the more you return to silence, the more the world reveals itself not as it is, but as it was made to be. You start noticing the patterns, not just in others, but in yourself. The way your thoughts loop in familiar rhythms, the way your emotions repeat old songs, the way your nervous system flinches at peace, as if calm is a threat. And you realize this isn't random. You were programmed to prefer noise, not just outside, but inside. The noise of shame disguised as motivation, the noise of judgment posing as standards, the noise of urgency, of never, enough, of your running out of time. That's not your inner voice, that's the system internalized. That's the echo of every institution, every culture, every trauma that taught you survival is better than stillness. And now that you're listening, really listening, you can finally hear the difference between your soul and your script, between your conditioning and your clarity, and that difference becomes everything. Because once you know the voice of truth, you can no longer follow the voice of fear, not without feeling the fracture, not without feeling the price, and that fracture becomes your teacher. Every time you betray yourself, it hurts faster, louder, sharper, not to punish you, but to wake you, to say, that's not who you are anymore. And you listen, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but with honesty, with humility, with grace, because grace is the currency of this path. You don't unlearn decades of noise overnight. You don't embody truth without shedding illusion. And shedding hurts. It's messy, it's confusing, but it's necessary, because silence isn't a destination, it's a process, a practice, a returning, again and again, to the space where nothing is demanded of you but honesty, where your pain doesn't need a purpose to be valid, where your joy doesn't need an audience to be real, where your being is enough simply because it exists, and in that existence you begin to understand what freedom really means. Not the ability to do whatever you want, but the ability to hear what you actually want beneath what you were told you should. That's the difference silence makes. It separates desire from programming. It reveals what was planted in you by fear and what was born from your truth. And most of what you thought you wanted, it was never yours. It was inherited, implanted, rewarded, but not real. And that realization is both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it shows you how long you've been running in the wrong direction. Liberating because now you can stop. You can turn, you can choose, not based on approval but on resonance, not based on fear but on truth. And truth is quiet. It doesn't force, it doesn't manipulate. It waits, it invites. And you are learning how to say yes to that invitation, even when it costs you the life you built from noise, even when it asks you to walk alone, even when it strips away every role, every label, every identity that once made you feel safe. Because you know now, safety built on illusion is not safety, it's a cage, and silence is the key. Not to escape the cage, but to realize it was never locked, that you were free the whole time, that the only thing keeping you there was the belief that you needed permission to leave, but you don't, you never did. And that realization, that subtle internal shift is the true liberation. It doesn't look like fireworks. It looks like breath, like a moment of stillness so deep you feel eternity in it, like a pause between thoughts where nothing exists but peace. And in that peace you finally feel yourself, not as an idea but as a presence that doesn't need to be explained, a presence that doesn't rise and fall with circumstance, a presence that simply is. And from that place, you live differently. You speak differently, you love differently. Not because you've changed on the surface, but because you've remembered who you were beneath the layers. And the world feels it. Not always kindly, not always consciously, but it feels it. Your silence creates ripples. Your presence shifts frequencies. Your being becomes a mirror. And not everyone is ready to see themselves. Some will lash out, some will project, some will distance themselves. That's okay. You're not here to convince. You're here to embody. And embodiment doesn't seek validation, it seeks alignment. And alignment will cost you the life you built from programming. But it will give you the life your soul has been waiting to live. One that doesn't perform, but expresses. One that doesn't please but resonates. One that doesn't fear silence but worships it. Because now you know, silence isn't empty. It's full of everything they tried to make you forget. And then it happens. Maybe not in a dramatic moment, maybe not with tears or trembling, but with something even more powerful. Stillness. A stillness so complete, it feels like the entire world exhales through your body. You feel it deep in your bones, that quiet knowing that nothing was ever missing, that you were never broken, that every false role you wore, every loop you repeated, every compromise you made was not a failure, but a path that brought you here, to this breath, this moment, this remembering. And suddenly the grief comes, not because something's wrong, but because something's ending. The war, the chase, the performance. You feel the ache of years spent outside yourself, of laughter that wasn't real, of dreams that weren't yours, of silence avoided, not because you feared it, but because you feared what it would show you. And now you see it all. The innocence behind the masks, the love buried beneath the proving, the truth that waited patiently through every noise-filled day, whispering, "Come home." And now you have. And there are no fireworks, no witnesses, no validation. Just presence, just peace, just you, whole, unedited, unrepeatable. This is the moment the program loses its grip. The script dissolves. Not because you fought it, but because you stopped needing it. You stopped chasing what you already are. You stop begging for permission to exist. You stop trying to become, and instead you allow. Allow truth to fill the spaces where noise once lived. Allow grief to cleanse you, not crush you. Allow silence to show you that God was never far away, only quiet. That heaven was never elsewhere, only buried. That freedom was never about escape, but about return. And in that return, you weep. You don't even know why. Maybe for the girl who learned to shrink. Maybe for the boy who had to be strong too soon. Maybe for the parts of you that no one clapped for, but were sacred all along. The soft, the sensitive, the silent. You don't cry from pain. You cry from recognition. You cry because something in you was just witnessed for the first time by you. And that kind of seeing changes everything. Because now you know nothing was ever wrong with you. What was wrong was the world that convinced you your truth had to be earned. You sit with that. Truth. And it doesn't speak in paragraphs or poetry, it just exists. Like the moon, like breath, like the space between heartbeats. And you realize this is what they feared. Not rebellion, not resistance, but remembering. Because a soul that remembers its origin cannot be owned, cannot be manipulated, cannot be sold a version of itself. And the moment you remember, you become untouchable, not in ego, but in essence. You stop flinching, you stop folding, you stop apologizing for your light. You let it shine, not to prove anything, but because that's what light does. And silence becomes your sanctuary, not because it protects you from the world, but because it returns you to yourself. And in that self, there is no shame, no role, no performance, just truth, breathing, alive, awake. Is this story resonating with you? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue. So now you're here, not at the end, but at the beginning that lives beneath every end. Not with all the answers, but with the silence that doesn't need them. You've stopped running, not because the world changed, but because you remembered you don't have to outrun what was never chasing you. You've returned, not to a location, but to a frequency. The one that was always there, humming beneath the static. You don't need to do anything now. You don't need to say anything profound or feel anything intense. Just breathe. Just be. Just allow the quiet to be enough. That's the final shift. When you know. Longer treat silence as a doorway to something else, but as the destination itself. When you stop asking it to reveal some secret and begin to realize it is the secret. The treasure wasn't hidden behind the silence. The treasure is the silence, the breath, the beat, the you that exists without needing to be seen, the you that is no longer driven by noise, but carried by something deeper, something ancient, sacred, and endlessly present. You'll go back into the world now. The traffic will still the phones will still buzz. People will still try to pull you into their urgency, but you'll be different. Not louder, not harder, just rooted, just aware. You'll still get triggered, still forget, still fall into old patterns sometimes, but now you'll notice. You'll return, quicker, gentler, without shame. That's the gift. Not perfection, but presence. The capacity to pause, to feel, to listen. Not to the noise, but to the signal beneath it. And as you listen, you become the signal. You walk into rooms and recalibrate the space, not with charisma, but with coherence. You become the silence they forgot they were seeking. You become the eye in the storm, the breath in the panic, the presence in the performance. And you won't need to explain it. You'll just be it. And some will thank you, some will resent you, but most will feel you, deeply, even if they don't know why. Because presence is a transmission, and your presence, once aligned, is more healing than any advice you could ever give. You won't need to preach truth, you'll embody it. You won't need to call people out, you'll call them in simply by being. That's the medicine this world has forgotten. Not more voices, but more vibration. Not more information, but more integration. And integration begins with stillness. It begins with this moment, right now, not someday, when you've healed enough or earned enough or feel ready. Now, as you are, unpolished, awake, real. So let this be the invitation to pause, to return. Not just once, but again and again. Let silence be your anchor, your compass, your prayer. Let it guide your no, your yes, your rest, your becoming. Let it hold you when the world is too loud. Let it remind you when the noise makes you forget. And when the silence feels empty, sit longer. There's always something waiting in it. A memory, a breath, a name, a truth. And maybe, just maybe, the version of you you've been chasing your whole life isn't out there in the world. It's sitting in the key, quiet, waiting for you to be still enough to meet them. So go meet them, not with striving but with surrender, not with expectation but with presence. And when you do, don't rush to tell anyone. Just live from that place, quietly, truthfully, radiantly. Because in a world that fears silence, your stillness is a revolution, your presence is prophecy, and your truth, carried softly, breathed fully, is the frequency that makes everything false begin to fall away. Have you ever done something kind that changed a life forever? Tell me in the comments, and if this story made you feel something, share it with someone who needs to remember who they are.